I'm honored to be here and to be a part of this, the first exhibition in a new series of Texas art projects, a collaboration between Stark Galleries at Texas A&M and art collectors and authors Bill and Linda Reaves. I want to thank the lenders to this exhibition, many of whom have graciously loaned to exhibitions that I have curated about Texas art over the past 14 years. Evocative Objects, Still Life Painting in Texas, is an insightful exploration of the radical evolution in the treatment of space, color, form, composition, and expression in still life painting in the state during the 20th century. From the century's first decade to the present day, many of the most accomplished artists in Texas embrace the still life as a vital opportunity for invention. The title of this talk is Reality Transformed, Still Life Painting in Texas. If the definition of a still life is a creative composition featuring recognizable inanimate objects selected, arranged, and realistically rendered, then why and how does transformation play a role in still life painting? Why aren't the paintings in this exhibition more alike within the general classifications of florals, game, tabletop arrangements of mundane objects, etc.? We can think about information that is helpful if we think of our actual artists' names and look at their career span, which are birth and death dates. We have 46 artists represented. Many have been well researched, and their names are certainly recognizable, but a few are rather obscure. If we look at the title of the specific piece, we can think some of these range from fully attributed to the artist. We know that this is the title they gave the work of art when it was made, to titles that have been lost to time and are listed as unknown. If we look at when the work of art was made, in this exhibition, the dates range from 1892 to 2014, with the majority created between 1930 and 1960. If we look at how each one of these objects was made, we can look at 23 paintings listed as oil on canvas paintings. 10 are oil on board, 4 are oil on masonite, 1 is oil on panel, 1 is oil on canvas board, and 1 is casing on masonite. 2 are listed as mixed media on board. We have 1 woodblock print, 2 lithographic prints, and a group of ceramics for a total of 46 different artists. If it is known where it was made, it is also an interesting addition to our understanding of the paintings. So we have who, what, when, how, and where, and it gives us the basic information. If we look at digital images, the lovely catalog that we have, beautiful reproductions, it can give us a reference point, but it certainly does not give us the experience of scale. But viewing the actual works of art is primary in gathering knowledge of Texas art and artists. And that is the focus of A&M's Texas Art series, of which this is but the first chapter. We will also, while we're talking about the art in the exhibition, talk about comparing and contrasting as a valuable tool for discovery. Challenging the common classification of the still life as a minor form, a perception that has haunted the genre throughout its century-old history, this exhibition reveals that still life paintings offer a unique index not only for the maker's interests and formal concerns, but also for the time and place of creation. This exhibition reveals several specific qualities that made the genre so attractive to artists and so enduring from the late 19th century through the 20th century in the state. Like many genres such as portraiture, landscape, and history painting, the still life has undergone substantial and radical transformations in the recent decades as artists have subverted and supplanted traditional notions of still life composition and imagery with new means of expression and new media. This exhibition examines how radical notions of time and place, reality and fiction, art and society have reordered our understanding of the still life. Still lifes, by their very nature, are highly contrived assemblages or narratives carefully constructed to amplify the mundane by altering and magnifying everyday objects, turning the commonplace into an evocative object. Still lifes are typically controlled by the artist from concept, selection of featured items, final arrangement, as well as the media and scale of representation. The 1930s era artists in this photograph are working from the central still life setup in the corner of the room. We know that each artist will produce their version of the common subject. There's a long tradition in art that requires drawing or painting from life. In front of the object, with the desired goal of perfectly replicating the subject. Here we see Robert Onderdonk, famed realist painter, painting from life in his studio in Dallas in the late 1800s. He is most likely the instructor, but the information on the photograph implies that he and Miss Brown are engaged in drawing what is just off camera to the left. If you have taken a beginning art class, this scene may be familiar as your first assignment. Students in a circle sitting around a central arrangement of carefully placed objects. The objective was to draw what was in front of you as accurately as possible, each drawing from a different angle. Same objects, different view, different artist, different outcome. This is the first step in developing hand-eye coordination. The eye means you observe or receive visual feedback, and the hand eventually learns to replicate what is seen. This skill is one that can be learned through practice. Focus and visual memory are the results. Training to develop visual awareness is an important first step as an artist. Eventually, the skill will become second nature, a vital tool in the artist's toolkit that can be developed from observation to replication to creative manipulation and eventually to personal interpretation. There's a long history of still life painting dating back to ancient Egyptian tombs and Roman frescoes. Still life painting became an official category in the history of art in the late 16th and 17th century in the Netherlands. We often think of still lifes as objective, based on reality, with the artist in front of the object working to capture an exact likeness. But that is not always the case. We assume detailed realism is a faithful record of reality. Dutch realism of this time is breathtaking in detail. Looking at a table-type still life arrangement on the left, William Klaus Heda, Dutch, 1593 to 1680, created this banquet piece with mince pie in 1635, and it is an oil on canvas. As Protestantism banned Catholic imagery, still life painting became a vehicle for moralist teachings on the temporary nature of life, the sins of wasteful extravagance, and the indulgence of physical appetites. Exotic foods like the lemon left on the table surfaces of glass, silver, pewter, fine linen, all held symbolic and moral meaning, the dangers of moral decay, vanity, and gluttony. The floral still life on the right is by John Doudt de Heem, Dutch, 1606, 1683. His vase of flowers from 1660 is an oil on canvas. The 31 species of plants in this vase cannot bloom in the same season. Many of these blossoms have symbolic meanings. The upper flowers thrive in the sunshine that streams through de Heem's studio windows, which we can actually see reflected in the crystal vase. The lower plants, farther away from the light of heaven, droop and wilt. Near the bottom, a salamander stares hungrily at a spider, while a snail, moth, and ants crawl on the marble shelf. All these creatures symbolize night, death, and decay. On the white poppy at the top, a caterpillar and butterfly evoke the idea of rebirth from a cocoon or the tomb. De Heem spent most of his career in Antwerp and Flanders. Colorful extravagance, typical of the Flemish taste, is noted in all of his still lifes. Mastery of realism is not always an indicator of the objective truth. So we might ask ourselves, how do the artists in this exhibition utilize the still life format to relate objective as well as subjective comments? As we explore our preconceived notions for what a still life should be, we can find specific categories such as game or the hunt, food, tabletop arrangements, and florals helpful as we compare and contrast. We can begin with the popular 19th and 20th century category of the game or the hunt. This still life oil painting on canvas was created by Jose Arpa. He lived 1858 to 1952. It's listed as Hunter's Catch, also known as Untitled Still Life with Dead Game and Brass Pot, from about 1900. Arpa studied at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Seville and in Rome before coming to San Antonio in 1896. In this painting, Arpa demonstrates the rigors of his Spanish academic realist training soon after he took up residence in San Antonio. While we see his ability to create startling, real replications in oil paint of the color and textures of feather and fur, we also see his expertise in capturing the visual effects of reflected sunlight on the brass bowl. He has been described both as a Spanish academic realist, an Orientalist, and a Spanish impressionist. This painting can also be classified as a traditional still life subject in the game, bounty of nature, or hunt genre. The academic mastery of little-known pioneer artist Eugenie Lavender is evident in still life with game birds, an ambitious masterwork in the academic realist style of still life painting. Eugenie Lavender was born in Paris in 1817 and died in Corpus Christi in 1898. Still life with game birds from 1892 is oil on canvas, painted when she was 75 years of age. She studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris with Paul Delroche, with fellow student Rosa Bonheur, where she was trained in the romantic, realist, academic style popular in France in the 1840s. Lavender moved to the U.S. in 1852 and eventually lived and worked in Dallas, Waco, Corpus Christi, and New Orleans. In this painting, we see luxurious detail of the feathers of exotic game birds, contrasting with wicker baskets, mistletoe, holly, a bird call, linens, and a neoclassical picture, set into the dramatic arched window with a distant landscape in the background. She was also an accomplished portrait painter and history painter. We have much more to learn about Lavender's career. Robert Onderdonk painted still life with fish around 1910. It is an oil on canvas. Robert Jenkins Onderdonk was an artist and a teacher. He was born in January of 1852 in Maryland. He studied in New York at the National Academy of Design and the Art Students League in the early 1870s. His professors included William Merritt Chase, and fellow students were George Ennis and John Henry Twatchman. The poetic realism popular at that time characterized Onderdonk's mature style. He painted still life, landscape, and portraits in his lifetime. Note at the academic dark background, building up to highlights of stunning contrast. The oval composition echoed in the copper pot in the background, balanced with green peppers. The photo in the upper right is Robert Onderdonk painting a portrait of Jessie Belknap from about 1883. Subjects in a work of art often grab our attention first. In this exhibition, we find 3 paintings with fish as the primary subject. Very different results in composition, media, and style. So what is the same and what is different? Robert Onderdonk's painting that we just talked about from 1910 is painted in the academic realist style of that era. On the top right, we see Paul Maxwell, Still Life with Fish, painted about 1959. It is also an oil on canvas. But here we see 1950s abstraction beginning to influence the still life. Identifiable objects, fish, plate, pitcher, vase on a table, and with a suggestion of three-dimensional space, is distorted by geometric shapes in the flattened picture plane, which are tenets of modernism. On the bottom, we see another work from the 1950s, 1957 work by Otis Dozier entitled Oil and Mixed Media on Masonite. Mixed media is net and a textured surface. We can see things embedded in it. Focuses on compressing the object into the picture plane. So we have the same subject from 1910, 1957, and 1959. Very different interpretations. In the 1950s, New York art critic Clement Greenberg asserted that abstraction was the new American art form. By challenging traditional painting and telling artists that they must abandon subject matter, depth of field, traditional illusions of realism, as well as any indication of the hand of the artist, was a real game changer for artists at this time period. Hallmarks of modernism abstraction include emphasis of the flat picture plane, skewed perspective, alternative materials, basic principles and elements of art prevail over subject matter, and this is eventually called arts for art's sake. Noting the date when the work of art was created and at what point in the artist's career it was made is also a way to understand the artist's motives. Does this mean that Maxwell and Dozier could not or were not capable of creating visual realism, or they simply made other choices? It is an error to assume starting with abstraction is easier because, in truth, abstraction evolves from mastery of basic techniques. Food is also a major still life category. Here we see similar color palette, focus on one type of fruit, isolated and carefully arranged in 2 paintings. Top right, Jack Key Flanagan painted figs in 1941. It's an oil on masonite. Flanagan was an artist, an art conservator. He studied at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston with Robert Joy and Frederick Brown. Here we see Flanagan painting an Cezanne-inspired loose brushwork, rich color, strong diagonal composition, but is not in a defined space. As far as exactly where it is on the table, this is a bird's eye view. There's a lot left unresolved in this painting. At the bottom, we see Kermit Oliver's Quince, painted in 1958. It's an oil on board. Simplicity, almost monotone, raking light, detail and solitude that we find in paintings by Andrew Wyeth. He was an alum of Texas Southern University. He's a master realist painter and a Texas legend. He's also what we call a reclusive artist. We see realism ripe with melancholy that spans the test of time. So in 58, this type of work is still relevant. Different in style, but still very relevant. In the category of food and still life, we can start to think about, looking at this comparison, whether the paintings are painted from life or from memory. Here we have the same subject, very different results, and this highlights the artist's goals and preference for representation. Here, 4 artists select watermelons as a subject, spanning 50 years of Texas art. One has only to study carefully the 5 paintings with watermelons as the primary subject in this exhibition to see the unique differences in each artist's rendition of the common subject. The top left, Robert Onderdonk, paints watermelons around 1900 in an oil on canvas. It's obviously academic realism, the texture of the heart of the melon, just off the vine. On the top right, Clifton King, Composition Mexico from 1936, is an oil on board. He adds figures. A bottle on the table seems to be in a different picture plane. The figures included are like a parenthesis in the composition, which is very crowded. On the bottom left, we have Everett Spruce Watermelons, 1945, oil on canvas. Angles abound. It is off balance, tilted tabletop, and it's set into a landscape. In the middle right, William Lester painted watermelons in 1948. Here he has incised his surface of the painting, fills the picture plane. The subject completely fills the picture plane. There's the energy of the paint application, and that almost distracts from the subject itself. In the bottom right, we have Enrique Gadbois, Watermelon and Pomegranate from 1953. It's flattened into an abstract group of shapes. In the bottom right, you can see how that is different from the somewhat illusion of space that you see in the other paintings. And this is all on the surface. If we look past the subject and consider how the illusion of space is handled in each one of these paintings, we learn a lot about the artist. We have a crowded scene with children and a watermelon skewed on a tabletop. We have textured and skewed tabletop tilted toward the viewer. We have removed the table altogether and geometrically incorporated the melons into the background. Also, we noticed that each one of these have in common the use of what we call local color, the color that we actually find in nature. There is a time when people go to unrealistic color, but here we see the common theme of the subject and local color. Here we can view 3 tabletop compositions that are all very different, yet the subject matter is similar. Amelia Erbach, Kitchen Table, 1945. We see that on the left. It's an oil on board. She was a student of Owen Travis. Realistic, yes, but a skewed view, and it's a blank background. She was very aware of current art trends in the 1940s. She exhibited at the Texas Centennial, the Southern Arts League, and studied at the Art Institute of Chicago. Top right, we see Chester Toney, 1952, with a double still life, oil on panel. He was a colleague of Cecil Casebeer and Bill Riley in San Antonio. Texas modernist, he was a Texas modernist known for his non-objective, expressionistic artwork that became more abstract over time. Michael Frary, White Base and Other Things, from 1950, is an oil on masonite. Frary was an American modernist from Santa Monica, California, who taught at the University of Texas, Austin, and was very influential in modernism in Texas. Frary experimented in a variety of media and styles. This highly textured surface covered all of the objects in this composition. He emphasizes the flat surface of the picture plane while suggesting depth only in the foreground. 3 tabletop still lifes, but very different results. 3 additional tabletop abstractions pushing the surface of the picture plane. Just as expression develops and evolves, still life painting has shown constant change in relation to the transformations of society as well as the artistic ambitions of each artist in their own time. This is true of the past and continues to be so in the present, making the still life a viable paradigm for the investigation of certain aspects of expression in the 20th century. The system inherent to still life in early abstraction is based essentially on a choice of objects and a manner of organizing them in the spatial field. On the left, we see Bill Condon's painting entitled, it's a mixed media on board. We see an incised surface, objects tilted so far toward the viewer they almost lose any sense of space. Space is completely reorganized. He was a Houston artist, an architect, who was probably very aware of how to use space and how to influence the picture plane. Jean Charlton, Cherries on the Table, upper right, 1947, oil on canvas. There are actually areas of exposed canvas here. We also see the texture of a lacy tablecloth over on the left. We see a plant in the window that appears to be almost created in a completely different style. The cherries seem to float on the table, on top of the linen, and take up the majority of the picture plane. Kathleen Blackshear, in 1930, painted this kitchen table, oil on canvas. She is known for her sensitive portraits, but she also chose to make still life. Kitchen Table is the title, and the black and white tablecloth underlies an overview of realistically rendered vegetables. I believe there's an eggplant, cauliflower, bell peppers, and tomatoes. But you can notice how the composition, once again, like the other two, completely fills the picture plane. Composition can be both ideological and formal, relating on the one hand to a personal worldview, and on the other to technique. The top right, we see the enduring relevance of still life painting evident in Magnolia in a Bowl of 2014 by David Bates. Bates, one of the state's most acclaimed contemporary artists, paints an annual Magnolia still life painting in honor of his mother. The result is a personal and respectful nod to traditional still life oil painting of a recognizable floral subject on a table, rendered in the artist's recognizable style with firm, dark outline and bold color harmonies. On the left is Cynthia Brandt's Still Life in Light from Window from 1947, oil on canvas. Brandt traveled extensively in Europe and was influenced by European modernism. The objects are transformed into rich planes of color inspired by Cubism. Cubism is defined as viewing the different sides of an object all on one picture plane. Richard Stout, in the bottom right, Untitled Basket of Flowers from 1954, oil on canvas. Stout was a student of Kathleen Blackshear at the Art Institute of Chicago in the 1950s. Stout was a Houston-based artist who was embracing abstraction in his 20s when this was painted. He later embraced a dreamlight abstract aesthetic referencing memory. His later non-objective works with no recognizable subject marked the height of his long and very productive career. Here we see 3 abstracted tabletop still lifes from the 1950s and 60s. On the top left, Herb Mears, Untitled Studio, 1956, oil on canvas. He was born in New York and lived in Houston and worked in Houston. He studied with Fernand Léger in Paris, where he met David Addix. What objects can you identify in this painting? You may have to look pretty close to find them. Our minds are always busy trying to find recognizable objects. Hints of reality can be found lingering in some abstract works, such as this one. The bottom, David Addix, Still Life with Lime, Melon Slices, 1957, oil on masonite. This is an early work that challenges the picture plane with a generic pattern background, while the edge of the table seems to extend out into our space. It was this Houston artist, sculptor with a long and successful career. On the right, we see Olive Pemberton, Round Table with Rose from 1967, oil on board. She flattens the surface of her minimalist-inspired still life. It's highly abstracted, upturned table in an ambiguous space, even though we have the pattern background or pattern floor. You're still not sure what's happening with the space beyond the picture plane. She exhibited with the Fort Worth Circle. In 2021, I understand the Fort Worth Community Arts Center will have a retrospective of her work. Still life painting is still a popular subject. Elsie Motts Loudon, Untitled Still Life from 1940, with an oil on board. And I'm also showing you a couple of examples of her lovely watercolors on ivory that are in the Smithsonian American Art Museum as well as in the Grace Museum collection. Still life as a pictorial genre, once considered a minor form of artistic expression and invention, was relegated to the lowest echelon in the academic hierarchy. Still life painting was often considered the province of technical training or relegated to women's work, not only for the presumed limited skills required, but also because of its depictions of the kitchen, dining room, or garden, seen as the woman's workplace. Nonetheless, a closer look at Untitled oil painting by Elsie Motts Loudon, who was nationally known for her portraiture, reveals that expert visual renderings of inanimate objects continue to be worthy of admiration and respect for the artist who created them, as well as a singular work of art. Successful artist sisters Elsie Motts Loudon and Mary Motts Wills were born in Waco and lived and worked in Abilene, Texas for many years. Loudon studied at Baylor University before moving to New York City to study the feminine art of portrait painting, watercolor on ivory. She was commissioned by some of the most prominent families in the U.S. to create these exquisite miniature portraits. This still life in the exhibit has lost its title. It is a graceful composition with a blurred background in animated lilies, intricate silver picture details, and one can ask yourself, is this painted from life? The sketches in the Grace Museum archives suggest that she painted from detailed sketches and kept a very detailed sketchbook for her portraits as well as her still life. Let's take another look at traditional, realistic floral still life painting that we see in this exhibition. In the bottom left, we see Ella McQueen's Texas Wildflowers from 1929. It's an oil on canvas. She's known as the organizer of the Texas Artist Camp in Cristobal. She's also known as an accomplished colorist of still lifes and landscape. This painting won third prize in Edgar B. Davis's Texas Wildflower Competition in 1929. Take a look. Note the vivid backlit composition, sunlight through sheer drapery with outlines of window pane shadows, highlighted color as only Ella McQueen could do. On the top left, we see Royston Nave, Still Life with Roses from 1922. It's an oil on canvas. It's a dark, ambiguous background and delicate roses in the foreground. Nave was born in LaGrange. I believe there's a Nave Museum there in Victoria. He studied with Ferdinand McCann in Victoria and Robert Henry, Pompeo Campini, and other famous artists in New York. He exhibited landscapes, still lifes, and portraits. Note the academic realism in the painting, the detailed reflection of the bowl and the dark, blank background. On the right, we see James Ferdinand McCann, Still Life Chrysanthemums, 1898, oil on board. Studied at the National Art Training School in London and came to the U.S. in 1897, 1 year before he painted this lovely painting. Known for his paintings of the King Ranch, active in San Antonio, Victoria, and Corpus Christi, was also a mentor to Royston Nave, we also see in this slide. Floral still lifes transformed by abstraction. On the far left, we see Deep Forest Judd, Caddo Lake, Still Life from 1954, oil on board. Judd was a native of Ohio who ended up teaching at SMU for most of his life. His mature work features abstract shapes in arbitrary colors, compressed and arranged to resemble landscapes or still life arrangements as seen in this painting. In the middle, we see Bill Bomar, untitled 1946, oil on canvas. He was a member of the Fourth Ward Circle. He studied at Cranbrook Art Academy in Michigan in the 1940s. This painting from 1946 is an early example of modernist abstraction by Bomar, blending the foreground and the background on a flattened picture plane. Top right, Ruth Pershing Euler, Lilies, about 1941, oil on canvas. She moved to Houston from Pennsylvania in 1909, then studied at Philadelphia School of Design, returning to Houston, Texas in 1925. She exhibited across the state in the 20s and 30s, visited Santa Fe with Grace Spalding John, and was inspired by the light and landscape of New Mexico, which influenced her work a great deal. This painting demonstrates her glowing and rhythmic style of abstraction. Bottom right, Emma Richardson Cherry, Decoration from 1920, oil on canvas. Known as a pioneer in modernist abstraction in Texas, she studied in Paris and in Europe in the 1880s. Cherry exhibited widely and was the founder of several important arts institutions and art schools in Houston. In the 1920s, few artists in Texas were working in an abstract style. This painting from 1920 blends realism with abstract background, a foretaste of the inroads of abstraction into the Texas art aesthetic. Still life in a landscape. This is an interesting concept. Is this manipulated, realistic imagery or an actual scene that we could encounter in the real world? Jerry Bywaters served for 35 years as faculty member at SMU's Division of Fine Arts and as director of the Dallas Museum of Art from 1943 to 1964. He was also a very accomplished artist who exhibited throughout the state. Underlining all of Bywater's work, as seen here, is the focus of the interaction of people with the land, whether the land served as a source of livelihood, a stage for historical events, a backdrop for architecture, or simply as a source for artistic inspiration. Jerry Bywater is the figurehead of the Dallas Nine, a group of artists in the 1930s who all focused on individual styles while working together to present unique aspects of the Texas landscape. Still life in a landscape, scale manipulated for effect, lessons from the land, focusing on the devastating effects of the Dust Bowl. At the bottom, we see Alexander Hoag's Into the Trail from 1936 lithograph from his famous erosion series. Lessons of mismanagement of the land during the Dust Bowl is the focus of this series. Hoag traveled from New York to Texas many summers to travel and sketch with the Texas landscape with Frank Ray, doing plein air studies. In 1925, Hoag moved to Texas, and in 1945, he became head of the art department at the University of Tulsa. The Dallas Nine artists, Jerry Bywater, Alexander Hoag, Thomas Stell, Harry Carnahan, Otis Dozier, William Lester, Everett Spruce, John Douglas, and Perry Nichols all rejected European abstraction in favor of realism in what became known as regionalism. Carl Rice Embry, Afternoon of the 7th from 1977, is an acrylic on panel. Embry was born and lives in Hamilton, Texas. He earned an MFA from the University of Texas, Austin, where he learned to paint in the abstract expressionist style of Pollock and de Kooning. And later, he transitioned to his own signature realistic style. His meticulously rendered scenes of a vacant home in Hamilton display his level of skill with acrylic paint on panel or board. His work is unique in his pursuit of a personal vision as opposed to the universal standard for contemporary art. It has been a journey back to his place of origin, the landscape, natural and man-made, of his ancestral home in Hamilton, where his family lived for over a century. His work is closer to the tradition and clarity of vision seen in the Dutch townscapes and still lifes we discussed at the beginning of this talk. Hundreds of hours of tedious work to complete one painting and catch the light as seen here. Embry states that his work is a product of imagination and memory as well as observation. A still life typically does not exist until the artist creates the model and sets the scene, which is to say that even the subject is conceived by the artist before beginning the painting or executing the work by his or her hand. The process of selection is traditionally influenced by the role certain objects play in the context of a given society at a given time. The deliberate choice of objects over others identifies them in the simplest sense as evocative objects. If you do not look closely, you might miss what the artist is saying about a seemingly ordinary interior view. Remember, art is a visual language, communicating across time with the viewer. But the still life is a work of art that is also an object about objects. It is the exploration of this paradox and the decoding of systems that structure and order the still lives that evocative subjects in this exhibition presents with new interpretations of a very familiar subject. For this is ultimately an exhibition about remarkable works of art by Texas artists, created over time in a myriad of style, subjects, and media. There are subtle messages in line, color, shape, scale, subject, and media that contribute to our reaction to what the artist has shared with us. Take note. Look closely and you will see that Embry has included a small button on the bench inside the window. A small still life laden with memory and mystery waiting to be discovered.